It is a truth not universally acknowledged that a man in possession of a perfectly amiable title, independent means, and an unnatural fondness for bucks, fugues, ought to resist, at all costs, the temptations of an amateur crime scene. Lord Peter Wimsey, however, had always taken pride in his perverse refusal to be sensible. On this particular Tuesday, cloud-dabbed and damp as all good murder days are, he found himself in the small village of Nether Wotton, reluctantly drawn from his Dorset retreat at the behest of his sister, Lady Mary, who had written, with her usual flair for understatement, that "something horrid has occurred at the rectory, and you really ought to have a look." The enclosed clipping, torn with irreverent haste from the Nether Wotton Chronicle, informed him of the tragic and unexplained demise of Miss Honoria Flint, a minor local historian of daunting hauteur and great fondness for photographic plates, who had expired in the vicarage study in circumstances most irregular. Wimsey, ever one to rise to an ambiguous invitation, took the Lagonda through the undulant Wessex lanes, and arrived in Nether Wotton mid-afternoon, just as the clouds were breaking like a scab over an overcast wound. The rectory, that drearily red-bricked edifice with clear-story windows that looked like eyes too tired to blink, stood as it always had, prim, pebble-dashed, and entirely unprepared for scandal. He was met at the garden gate by the Reverend Septimus Carruthers, a mild-eyed cleric whose face always gave the impression that it was about to apologize. "My dear Lord Peter, how good of you," the vicar murmured, wringing his thin hands like a man hoping to rid them of metaphysical sin. Wimsey waved a languid glove. "Not at all, Carruthers. Any excuse to postpone the end of Middlemarch is welcome. I suppose you have a corpse to show me." Yes. Quite. In the study was a cool, lamp-lit room with shelves of tedious exegesis and an alarming number of bird figurines. Miss Honoria Flint's body had already been removed, though the room bore the stillness peculiar to places lately emptied of death. On the vicar's mahogany writing desk, however, lay the item that had prompted Wimsey's summons, a sepia photograph, uncannily well developed, depicting Miss Flint herself. She was seated, looking directly at the camera, her expression fixed in that tight-lipped defiance peculiar to the childless and overqualified. But it was not her expression that disturbed the villagers. It was the date, scrawled in neat pencil on the white margin, taken Tuesday, 27th May, 3:30 p.m., the time of her death. Wimsey squinted. Yes, very tidy composition. And of course, one can't take a photograph after one's own death without assistance. Unless Miss Flint was a great believer in posthumous portraiture, which seems rather nouveau for a woman who still said wireless set with disdain. Carruthers cleared his throat. "And yet," Wimsey went on, examining the photograph beneath his monocle, "there she is, absolutely herself. No sign of rigor mortis, not a hint of sepulchral gloom. Photographed, apparently, at the precise moment when her lungs ceased their enthusiastic partnership with oxygen. How vexing." "The constable believes she must have taken it herself," Carruthers offered, with the hesitant air of one proposing spontaneous combustion as a viable theory. "But who, my dear vicar, wrote the date, and why is the window open? It rained torrentially that afternoon." Carruthers blinked. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything dull people overlook. That, in essence, is what makes me such a thorough nuisance to Scotland Yard." There was a knock, discreet and deferential. A maid, pale as laundry water, entered with tea. "Begging pardon, sir. Inspector Thurkettle's arrived and asks for Lord Peter." Wimsey accepted the teacup, ignoring the slight tremor in the girl's wrist. "Then do let him in, Bessie. I'd be charmed to have my logical faculties insulted." Inspector Thurkettle was precisely the sort of man who believed in robust conclusions and despised ambiguity on principle. He entered with the prideful urgency of a man who had already solved the crime and now merely required witnesses to sign off on the genius. Afternoon, Lord Peter. Vicar, we've had the pathologist round. Woman died of cyanide, delivered in what we believe was a glass of sherry. No sign of forced entry. The door was locked from the inside. Servants were in the kitchen. Miss Flint was quite alone. Indeed, murmured Whimsy, sipping his tea. Alone, save for the phantom photographer. Thurkettle frowned. We think she used a timer. Then she must also have used a posthumous pencil to label it so neatly. A polymath indeed. Thurkettle turned a shade darker. The photograph is curious, but not, I think, material. Whimsy rose, walked to the window and examined the latch. It was dusted with rain spatter. The sill was damp. It's remarkable, he mused, how often photographs lie, or rather, how precisely they tell a truth no one wishes to see. He turned, smiling faintly. And how very inconvenient that this one exists at all. Carruthers looked queasy. Do you mean to say murder? Oh, murder is such a melodramatic word, said Whimsy. I never use it before supper. Let us say instead a photograph that shouldn't exist, and a woman who ought not to have taken it, yet clearly did. The rest, I fancy, will follow. He picked up the photograph once more and studied it very closely for the third time. Tell me, Carruthers, did Miss Flint ever express an interest in ghosts? The vicar paled, but Whimsy merely chuckled and asked for another cup of tea. Whimsy lingered by the study window, allowing the quiet tap of drizzle against the pane to fill the silence that Inspector Thurkettle's departure had left. The photograph rested on the desk, innocuous in its sepia calm, but Lord Peter kept glancing at it as though it might shift under observation. Carruthers, having offered a vague platitude about Providence, now busied himself with the samovar like a man who found in tea-making a refuge from metaphysical dread. Tell me, Vicar, Whimsy said at length, turning from the window with that abruptness which made his inquiries feel both innocent and surgical. Miss Flint was a local fixture, I gather? Not one for sudden adventures? Carruthers chuckled nervously, polishing a teacup with his handkerchief. Goodness, no. She loathed change. Thought the railway line to Upper Frampton was the thin end of moral collapse. She came here 30 years ago to catalogue the Wadden family tombs and simply remained. Inherited a little from a cousin, rented a room at Mrs. Prowse's on the Green, and spent her days chastising the young and annotating gravestones. No peculiar friendships? No sudden passions for German theology or suspiciously charming milkmen? None that would provoke murder, I should think, Carruthers said a little too quickly. Though she had a curious relationship with the Blundells. Local gentry. Very minor, rather bankrupt. Live out past the meadows. She advised Miss Diana Blundell, poor girl, lost both parents young, on her genealogical claims. There was talk of some inheritance, but nothing came of it. Whimsy lifted a brow. Advised, you say? Was Miss Flint legally trained? Good Lord, no. Merely possessed of boundless confidence and a suspiciously comprehensive knowledge of county registries. Fascinating. I do admire a woman who can eviscerate a family tree with the flick of a biro. Carruthers frowned. She was, in truth, rather too enthusiastic. Her revelations about parish lineages caused more than one awkward silence at church teas. I believe she once declared that half of Nether Wadden descended from a Tudor stable boy and the other half from a Huguenot deserter. A formidable historian indeed, Whimsy murmured. And how did she get on with the household staff here? You said she died in your study. Was that customary? Carruthers blinked. Well, not customary, no. But she often came round to consult my library. She had permission to let herself in. Bessie would have seen her come through the garden gate that afternoon. The study door was locked from the inside, as I told the inspector. When Bessie brought in her usual tea tray and found no reply, she fetched me. We had to force the door. There she was, collapsed in the chair. The sherry decanter was beside her. She poured it herself. No fingerprints but her own. Yet someone added a caption to that photograph. Carruthers flinched. "You're quite sure?" "Quite. The graphite is smudged, but not by age. That pencil stroke was no more than an hour or two old when the thing was found." "Do you know where the camera is?" "In the drawer by the hearth. Shall I fetch it?" Wimsey nodded, and Carruthers obliged, returning with a boxy old model that looked as though it might require ritual incantation to operate. Wimsey examined it delicately, sniffed it, and nodded. "Used recently, still smells of thiosulfate, and quite incapable of producing a portrait with that crisp depth unless the subject sat perfectly still. Like a corpse, in fact. Curious." He turned the device over again. A strip of exposed film was jammed in the cartridge. Wimsey extracted it with gloved fingers and laid it gently on the blotting pad. "We'll have that developed," he said softly. "But for now, I should like a word with your maid." Bessie proved a fragile blonde with nervous hands and a passion for sighing. She recounted, with redundant thoroughness, how she had seen Miss Flint pass through the garden gate at precisely 3:15, carrying her satchel and wearing a long grey shawl that smelled faintly of liniment. The front door had been unlatched, as was usual when Miss Flint was expected. She'd gone directly into the study. "Was anyone else in the house?" "No, sir. Vicar was out walking to Upper Wadden. I was in the kitchen stewing prunes." "A noble occupation. And when did you take the tea tray in?" 4:00, sir, just on the dot. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, and then I fetched the Reverend. We thought she'd fallen asleep, but the door wouldn't open." "Quite. Was the sherry in the room when she arrived?" "No, sir. I brought it in, like always, 10 minutes after she'd gone in. Just set it by the chair. Didn't speak to her." Wimsey turned slightly. "Then between 3:30 and 4:00, she was entirely alone in the study. Or so you suppose?" "Yes, sir. No one else was near the house. Leastways, not that I saw." "But someone opened the window," Wimsey said mildly. Bessie paled. "No, sir. It was shut tight that morning. Rain was coming. I'd have seen if it were open." "And yet it was open when the inspector arrived." She faltered. "Must have been after." "Must it? Thank you, Bessie." "That's all." Wimsey returned to the study, his gaze distant. He picked up the photograph again, studying the slight distortion at the edges. Lens curvature, or something more intentional. "Carruthers," he said suddenly. "This woman, Diana Blundell. Where does she live precisely?" "The old Blundell estate. Wadden Mere. It's a mile down the track from the crossroads. Some say it's haunted, but I dare say you don't believe in such things." Wimsey smiled thinly. "Oh, I believe in everything until it proves inconvenient. Shall we take a drive?" They left just before dusk, the clouds peeling away into bruised lilac as the countryside folded itself into that brooding quiet peculiar to rural England after a sudden death. The road to Wadden Mere was rutted and narrow, hedged with nettles and cow parsley. The house itself was an architectural lament, a crumbling Queen Anne manor with boarded windows and a roof that sagged like a confession. Miss Diana Blundell received them in a darkened parlor, her appearance striking, sharp cheekbones, a high, intelligent forehead, and fingers that looked as though they might have once played piano, but now preferred paper. "Yes," she said after introductions, "I knew Miss Flint. Intimately, I might say. She was both mentor and antagonist. She believed my great-uncle's will had been tampered with, thought the Blundell estate had been misallocated to a cousin's line." "And did she pursue this belief?" Wimsey asked, selecting a tattered settee with only mild disgust. "She did. Spent months in diocesan archives. I rather think she hoped I might inherit a better house than this, should the claim prove valid. But lately she had grown wary." "Of what?" She never said precisely, only that someone was interfering with history. I thought it poetic nonsense. She said she had proof. Something that would restore order to the bloodline. Her phrase, not mine. I saw her last week. She seemed elated. Said she would show me the truth next Tuesday. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. The day of her death. Diana nodded. And now she's gone, along with whatever truth she thought she had uncovered. Lord Peter gazed out the dusty parlour window at the moor beyond, shadowed now by twilight. Somewhere in the wet grass, a fox barked. She wasn't wrong, he said quietly. Someone has interfered with history, only not in the way she expected. You see, Miss Blundell, someone forged a moment and then killed to protect the lie it told. He rose. I shall need to look at the church registers, and if I may, borrow a lantern. The past has been rewritten, and I believe it's buried somewhere inconvenient. Diana stared at him. You really think this is about bloodlines? I think, said Whimsy, eyes distant, it's about the fear of being erased. The following morning was raw with mist, the village of Nether Whaddon wrapped in a woolen fog that blurred the outlines of cottages and cloisters alike. Whimsy had insisted on an early start, his mind working like a finely tuned clock, ticking toward some invisible mechanism beneath the surface of the mundane. Carruthers, ever the faithful attendant, fetched the lantern and led the way to the parish church, a grey sentinel crowned with moss and stained glass that shimmered faintly even in the overcast light. Inside, the air was heavy with a scent of damp stone and old incense. Whimsy's eyes flicked over the pews and altar, but it was the small vestry, lined with shelves of ancient leather-bound registers, that commanded his attention. The registers themselves were a testament to the village's layered history, the names and dates penned in looping copper plate from a century or more ago. Whimsy's fingers traced the cracked spines, seeking the volumes from the years Miss Flint had frequented the archives. The lady was certain the Blundell inheritance was misallocated, he murmured. If so, the answer must lie here, in these pages, carefully disguised amongst the baptisms, marriages, and deaths. Carruthers shivered as the lantern's flicker cast long, distorted shadows. It's all very well to suggest forgery, Lord Peter, but how could someone rewrite history without anyone noticing? Ah, my dear vicar, Whimsy replied, arching a brow. One learns quickly how to disguise ink changes under dim candlelight. Besides, it is not merely the records we must consider, but the witnesses, those still living who might have been coaxed or coerced into complicity. They began their methodical examination of the registers, page by painstaking page, until Whimsy paused over a curious entry. The birth of a child, listed as Anne Blundell, 1867, bore a slight smudge over the year, as though an inked correction had been hastily applied. His eyes narrowed. Notice the blotch here, he said. An attempt to obscure the date, perhaps. Carruthers peered over his shoulder, and the signature beneath it, unsteady, almost trembling. A vicar unfamiliar with his own hand, or a falsifier's imperfect mimicry. Precisely. Whimsy tapped the page. Look here. The baptism took place 3 weeks later than customary. An unusual delay in a time and place where the community was otherwise meticulous. Carruthers frowned. What does this imply? That someone wished to cast doubt on Anne's legitimacy, or perhaps on her very existence. Whimsy's voice lowered. We are dealing with a deliberate erasure, Vicar, a subtle crime committed in ink and paper rather than blood and gunpowder. Carruthers shuddered. This is darker than I imagined. Whimsy closed the register gently and turned. Come, we must visit the Blundell estate again. The drive back was a silent one, the carriage wheels striking the sodden earth with steady rhythm. Whimsy's mind seemed elsewhere, his gaze fixed not on the road but on the swirling mists that hugged the fields. Miss Diana Blundell mentioned the phrase, "Restore order to the bloodline." A quaint expression, but it suggests a motivation deeper than mere money. Perhaps pride, Carruthers ventured, the fear of a sullied family tree? Indeed, and pride, when combined with desperation, is a powerful spur to deceit and even murder. At Wadden Mere, the dusk had settled fully, draping the house in a cloak of shadows. The parlour was gloomier than before, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and faded perfume. Diana greeted them again, this time with a guarded expression. "Have you found anything?" she asked. "Some irregularities in the parish records," Wimsey said. "More importantly, I must ask, were there any recent visitors to your estate who might have had an interest in the family archives?" Diana hesitated, fingers tightening around the edge of a velvet cushion. "My cousin, Reginald Blundell. He's been quite persistent of late, pressing for access to documents and letters long locked away." "Reginald," Wimsey mused aloud. "The prodigal nephew, as I recall. Is he nearby now?" "Not in residence, no. He's in London, I believe. But he visits frequently, and his letters have a rather insistent tone." "Insistent enough to be called a threat, perhaps?" Diana flushed. "No, but unsettling. He's always been ambitious. Since father's death, he's believed the estate should pass to him, not me. Our family quarrels are hardly a secret." Wimsey's gaze sharpened. "And did Miss Flint have any contact with this Reginald? Letters, meetings, or veiled conversations?" "Not that I know. But if anyone were to forge documents or tamper with records, Reginald would be the obvious suspect." "Obvious, yes. But that is rarely the same as true." He rose, lantern in hand. "I shall have need of those letters. Might you fetch them for me on my return to London?" "Certainly." That night, back at Nether Wadden Vicarage, Wimsey sat alone, the study lamp casting a golden pool of light over the scattered documents he had brought from the church. The photograph, now carefully preserved, lay beside the letters from the Blundell estate, their crispness belying the weight of history they carried. He studied the letters through the dim light, noting the carefully chosen words, the subtle insinuations, the attempts to unsettle and unsettle again. Reginald's tone was indeed persistent, but artfully veiled. "You must acknowledge the rightful succession," one letter read, "lest history itself be forced to recall its errors in a less forgiving manner." Wimsey chuckled softly, lighting a cigar with the mechanical precision of a man accustomed to small rituals. "History's errors," he muttered, "are as vulnerable as the men who write them. But it is the fear of exposure that drives the desperate hand." He leaned back, eyes closing briefly, replaying the afternoon's conversations. The study window rattled with a sudden gust of wind, and for a moment the house seemed to exhale some long-held breath. The open window in Carruthers's study, the smudged parish register, the faint scent of liniment on Miss Flint's shawl, all were threads in a tangled web. Wimsey's mind traced the outlines of a scenario. Miss Flint had discovered something significant, perhaps a forged birth record or a concealed lineage. She had intended to reveal it at Wadden Mere on that fateful Tuesday. Someone, fearing disgrace or loss, had intervened, silencing her before she could expose the truth. Yet who and how? The answer, Wimsey felt, lay not just in documents or threats, but in the small, overlooked details. The precise timing of Miss Flint's movements, the unlocked door, the open window, and, curiously, the photograph itself. Why had the photograph been altered? The pencil caption was recent, a deliberate addition. Had Miss Flint taken the picture herself, or had it been planted to mislead? Wimsey glanced at the camera, still waiting quietly on the desk, and the answer began to crystallize. The camera was bulky, cumbersome, ill-suited to surreptitious use. Yet the photograph was detailed and sharp. It required a patient subject. Was the photograph a forgery? Or had Miss Flint posed her own final confession? The night deepened, and with it, the sense that the quiet village hid more than shadows. Somewhere, a truth waited, patient and unmoving, like a gravestone beneath the soil. Whimsy stubbed out his cigar. Tomorrow would bring questions of light and time, of locked doors and silenced witnesses. For now, the photograph and the registers were his allies in a game that had barely begun. The morning brought with it a brittle clarity, the fog finally lifting to reveal a landscape still wet with the residue of dawn's chill. Whimsy and Carruthers returned to Wattenmere with the letters carefully packed in a leather satchel, the weight of ink and paper somehow heavier than their physical mass. Diana received them in the same parlour where the previous evening had unfolded, her composure steadier now, though her eyes betrayed an unspoken anxiety. "I trust you will be discreet," she said quietly as she took the satchel. "These letters are private, and their contents could unsettle more than just family pride." Whimsy inclined his head with a courteous smile. "Discretion is a fine art, Miss Blundell, one I have cultivated over many years, and only to occasionally set it aside when justice demands." She allowed herself a faint smile in return, though the tension lingered. "I suppose that is why you're here." "Indeed," Whimsy replied. "Might I inquire about the household on the evening Miss Flint was found? You mentioned the presence of a butler and a footman, but who else was about?" Diana's gaze sharpened. There was Mrs. Fenwick, our housekeeper, an imposing woman, very loyal, and Mary, the maid. Neither of them left the estate that evening. Loyalty can be a double-edged sword, Whimsy mused. And what of Reginald's recent visits? Was anyone here who could have seen him or corresponded on his behalf? Diana hesitated, then shook her head. No, no one. The letters came by post, always carefully addressed and often sealed. We thought little of it at the time. Curious, Whimsy muttered, that someone so insistent on reclaiming what they believed theirs would take such pains to conceal their involvement. Before Diana could respond, the heavy oak door creaked and Mrs. Fenwick entered. Her bearing was stern but not unkind, the lines on her face betraying a lifetime of service and secrets. "Lord Peter," she said in her clipped tones, "I understand you wish to know who was in the house that evening." "Yes, Mrs. Fenwick," Whimsy replied, "and any peculiarities you might have noticed." Her eyes flickered toward Diana, then back to Whimsy. "Well, it was a quiet night, save for the storm that rolled in after supper. Mary was off duty early, the footman attending to the stables, and Reginald was not here, as you know. I myself was in the kitchen most of the evening, and the butler kept the wine cellar. Nothing unusual, save for Miss Flint's strange insistence on seeing Miss Diana late in the day." "Strange how?" Whimsy pressed gently. She was restless, more than usual. Kept pacing the corridors, asking about old letters and the estate's history. When Miss Diana told her to stop, she only grew more persistent. "Did anyone else hear her or see her that evening?" Whimsy asked. "No one but Miss Diana and myself," Mrs. Fenwick said, though there was the matter of the door to the library. "The library?" Whimsy repeated. "Yes. The door to the library was found ajar the morning after Miss Flint's death. It was always kept locked after dark." Whimsy exchanged a glance with Carruthers. "Was the library on the route Miss Flint would have taken to see Miss Diana?" "Indeed, it was the shortest path." "Was there anything missing from the library? Books, papers, any sign of a struggle?" Mrs. Fenwick shook her head. "No sign of struggle. But there was something odd about the position of the clock on the mantelpiece. It was not quite aligned as it usually is." Whimsy's eyes brightened. "How very observant. A misaligned clock is often a small but telling sign." He leaned forward. "May I see this clock?" Mrs. Fenwick led them to the library, a dim room lined with mahogany shelves and illuminated only by the weak sunlight filtering through the heavy drapes. On the mantelpiece rested a brass clock, its face slightly tilted, as if nudged by an unseen hand. Whimsy examined it closely, noting a faint smear of grease on the side where it met the wood. This clock was moved recently, likely to conceal something behind it. Carruthers looked impressed. "How very cunning," Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. Or very careless. He carefully lifted the clock, revealing a small recess in the wood behind it. Inside was a folded bundle of papers, yellowed and brittle. Diana gasped softly. That must be Father's correspondence. He kept many letters here, some of great importance. Whimsy unfolded the top letter and read aloud. To whom it may concern, I hereby affirm that the true heir to the Blundell estate is Anne, born of my late brother's legitimate line. Any attempt to dispute this will be met with the full weight of the law. He glanced up. This letter is recent, yet bears the signature of your father, who died 10 years. Argo? Diana nodded, a shadow crossing her face. Father believed there was foul play in the succession. He wrote this to set the record straight, but it was never made public. Curious, Whimsy said, that such a letter should be hidden away, almost as if someone wanted to keep this truth buried. Carruthers asked, Do you believe Reginald knew of this letter? I do, Diana admitted. He would have fought tooth and nail to prevent it from surfacing. Whimsy folded the letter carefully and replaced the clock on the mantelpiece, now perfectly aligned. This changes the picture considerably. The motive for silencing Miss Flint becomes clearer. She must have been close to discovering these letters or their contents. He paused, considering. But what of the photograph? Diana looked puzzled. The one found with Miss Flint? Yes. It depicts a young woman, presumably Anne, though the writing on the back is a recent addition. Diana frowned. It was Miss Flint's prized possession, though she rarely spoke of it. Do you know where she might have obtained it? From the family collection, I believe. Father kept many portraits and photographs in the attic. May we see this collection? Diana led them upstairs, the house creaking softly underfoot. In a dusty room, she pointed to a large trunk. The family keeps its most precious memorabilia here. Father was quite particular about it. Whimsy carefully opened the trunk, revealing a trove of photographs, letters, and old documents. Among them, a faded picture matching the one found with Miss Flint. But this one, Whimsy said, is pristine, almost too well preserved. It suggests recent handling, if not recent manufacture. He traced his finger over the edges, noting the absence of the typical wear. Something about this is staged, designed to mislead. Diana looked troubled. Why would Miss Flint carry a forgery? Perhaps she intended to expose it, Whimsy said softly. Or perhaps it was planted to implicate someone else. Carruthers looked at him quizzically. You believe the photograph itself is a piece of the puzzle? More than that, my good man, Whimsy said. It is a thread that, when pulled, may unravel the entire tapestry. The afternoon waned as Whimsy continued to sift through the papers, his mind drawing connections invisible to all but the most meticulous observer. There was a rhythm to the evidence, a pulse beneath the surface of ink and glass, and he was determined to follow it to its source. Outside, the shadows lengthened and the day grew cold, but inside the house, the silent conversation between past and present continued, whispered through the pages of forgotten letters and the cold gaze of a photograph that should never have existed. The waning light cast long, solemn shadows across the cluttered attic, where Whimsy and Carruthers stood among the relics of a family's faded glory. The very air seemed saturated with the weight of unspoken secrets and carefully preserved facades. Whimsy's gaze, however, was far from sentimental. It was dissecting, parsing every detail with clinical precision. Tell me again, Whimsy said, holding the pristine photograph delicately between thumb and forefinger. When was this particular copy last accounted for in the family archives? Diana's voice trembled slightly. It was certainly not listed in Father's inventory, nor in the catalogue kept by the house steward. The collection here is thorough, but this one is new, or at least newly introduced. Carruthers, leaning against a dusty trunk, chimed in, which suggests someone deliberately introduced this photograph recently, perhaps to serve a particular purpose. Precisely, Whimsy said, nodding slowly. an anachronism in a family collection, not unlike a modern coin in a Victorian purse. Diana frowned. But why, and who would benefit? Someone with much to gain and little regard for the truth, Whimsy answered. Or perhaps someone who wished to frame another. He turned the photograph, studying the inscription on the reverse, penned in an unfamiliar hand. Anne Blundell, rightful heir, 1924. The ink, though aged in appearance, was suspiciously fresh. Carruthers tapped his chin thoughtfully. If this is a forgery, the question becomes who created it and who planted it. And why, Whimsy added. Every forgery has a motive behind it, often not merely to deceive, but to manipulate. His fingers brushed a stack of letters on the trunk, their edges yellowed but well preserved. These letters, the photograph, the mysterious presence of Miss Flint. Everything points to a deliberate attempt to rewrite history. But not by the deceased father. No, this was orchestrated more recently. Diana looked away, her face pale. You believe someone in the household might be involved? I would not discount it, Whimsy replied, eyes narrowing. The more intimate the access, the more dangerous the opportunity. As he spoke, a soft creaking sounded from below, faint but distinct against the silence. Both men turned sharply toward the attic stairs, which lay shrouded in shadow. Visitors at an hour so late, Carruthers whispered, reaching for his revolver. Whimsy raised a finger. Patience. There is no need for alarm without cause. They descended quietly, the wooden steps groaning beneath their feet. Reaching the landing, Whimsy paused and listened intently. From the corridor beyond the attic door came the unmistakable sound of whispered voices. Whimsy moved swiftly, his hand lightly pressing against the door to eavesdrop. The voices were low, cautious, and distinctly female. You said you wouldn't tell anyone, one voice said, trembling. I did not say that. I said I would protect you, but only if you trust me, replied the other, firm yet gentle. The first voice gasped softly. But if Lord Peter finds out, you forget your position, the other voice interrupted. We must be careful. One misstep and the entire house will be engulfed. Whimsy stepped back and exchanged a glance with Carruthers. An alliance or conspiracy, no doubt. He turned to Diana, who had appeared quietly behind them. Miss Blundell, it appears the house is not as silent as it seems. She paled visibly. Who is it? Two voices, one fearful, one protective. Might they be among your household staff? I cannot say, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But I must know. Whimsy nodded. As must I. Let us proceed with discretion. They moved toward the servant quarters, where the faint light of a single candle flickered behind a half-closed door. Pausing, Whimsy tapped lightly. Miss Fenwick, is that you? The door opened cautiously, revealing a young woman with wide, anxious eyes. Mary, the maid. Lord Peter, she breathed, startled. I did not expect you here. Neither did I, Miss Mary, but the house speaks in whispers, and I have learned to listen. She hesitated, then stepped aside. Come in. Inside was another woman, older and more composed, whom Whimsy instantly recognized as Mrs. Fenwick. Miss Mary has much to tell, I imagine, Mrs. Fenwick said with a slight nod. Indeed, Whimsy said, taking a seat. I understand there are secrets kept not just in letters, but in spoken word. Mary glanced nervously at Mrs. Fenwick. Miss Flint. She came to me days before she died. She was frightened. She said she had found something that would change everything about the Blundell family. And you? Whimsy inquired. What did you do? Mary swallowed hard. I promised not to speak of it. I was afraid. Then Miss Diana asked me about her movements, and I felt caught between loyalty and fear. Mrs. Fenwick sighed. Miss Flint was not the woman she seemed. She had her own agenda and was not above manipulation. Whimsy steepled his fingers. This confirms my suspicion that the surface civility of Wattenmere masks a far more complex web of alliances and betrayals. Miss Flint mentioned a photograph, Mary added, one that was not meant to be found. Whimsy looked sharply at Diana. You see now why the photograph's authenticity matters so much. Yes, Diana said, trembling. But if it is a forgery, then who benefits from such deception? Someone desperate to rewrite the family's history and inheritance, Whimsy said. The question remains. Who? Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. A uniformed constable entered, bearing a telegram. From the station, my lord, the constable said. Urgent news regarding Reginald Blundell. Whimsy broke the seal and read swiftly. Reginald Blundell detained in nearby village on suspicion of forging documents and attempting to intimidate witnesses. More details to follow. Carruthers' eyes narrowed. It appears the game is changing. Whimsy smiled faintly, the faintest trace of irony curling his lips. Indeed, the most obvious suspect may be attempting to cover his tracks or proving his desperation. He folded the telegram and looked toward Diana. Your cousin's arrest will bring new questions to light, but it will not bring us answers. For that, we must look deeper. Diana nodded, steeling herself. What do you propose, Lord Peter? Whimsy stood, lighting a slender cigarette with the practiced flourish of a connoisseur. We follow the threads. Letters, photographs, whispered secrets. They all lead somewhere, and I intend to be there when the tapestry unravels. As the candle flickered and the night deepened outside, Whimsy felt the unmistakable thrill of a puzzle yet to be solved. A dance of shadows where every detail mattered and every silence spoke volumes. The photograph that shouldn't exist was but a single note in a symphony of deceit, and he was determined to hear the final chord. The morning sun crept tentatively through the heavy drapes of Wattenmere's drawing room, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the stale air. The house, with its stern, ivy-clad facade, seemed less a sanctuary and more a fortress guarding secrets far too perilous to be freely admitted. Lord Peter Whimsy stood by the window, cigarette poised but forgotten, his mind racing through the intricate web they had begun to unravel. Carruthers sat opposite, boots planted firmly on the Persian rug, the telegram still in his hand as if it might reveal its contents anew. Diana lingered near the hearth, her face a mask of quiet determination, though the faint lines of anxiety betrayed her resolve. Reginald's arrest has stirred the village like a disturbed hornet's nest, Carruthers observed dryly. The local constabulary seem rather keen to pin the forgery on him. Whimsy's lips twitched into a half-smile. Naturally. The more obvious the suspect, the more readily justice is served. But justice, dear Carruthers, is rarely so straightforward. Diana broke in, Lord Peter, if Reginald is innocent, who else could have the means and motive to fabricate such a photograph? And what about this intimidation mentioned in the telegram? Whimsy considered the question carefully, then gestured toward the letters they had discovered in the attic, arranged neatly on a small writing table. The motive, as we have surmised, lies buried in the tangled roots of inheritance and identity. The photograph suggests a claim from the past, a rightful heir whose existence threatens the current family narrative. But to forge such a document requires more than ambition. It requires access, knowledge, and opportunity. Which narrows the field significantly, Carruthers added. Whimsy's eyes sparkled with that particular gleam of connoisseurship reserved for a case ripe with intellectual challenge. Indeed, access implies someone close to the family, someone trusted or overlooked whose movements escape scrutiny. Knowledge means familiarity, not just with the family history, but with the precise details needed to make a forgery plausible. Opportunity implies timing, and herein lies the crux. We must examine Reginald's whereabouts during the relevant period more closely. Diana's gaze dropped to her hands, clasped tightly. Reginald's alibi was somewhat vague at best. He claimed to be visiting a friend in the village at the time the photograph supposedly surfaced, but no one seems to have seen him. Exactly, Whimsy said. And vague is a favorite refuge of the guilty, but also sometimes the frightened innocent. He rose abruptly and walked to the grand-grandfather clock that dominated the corner. His hand rested lightly on its mahogany case. You know, it strikes me as peculiar that the clock's hands do not quite align with the household's reported timings. Several of the servants' testimonies regarding Reginald's movements do not correspond with the clock's chimes. Carruthers frowned. Are you suggesting the clock is inaccurate? More than that, Whimsy replied. It is slightly slow by approximately 3 minutes, a trivial discrepancy to most, but critical when reconstructing alibis. He tapped his cigarette on the ashtray, scattering a few embers. It seems someone has tampered with the timekeeping devices to create confusion, perhaps to manufacture alibis or mask movements. Diana looked up sharply. But why? And who would benefit from confusing the timeline? Ah, my dear, that is the puzzle. But I suspect the answer lies in who stood most to lose if Reginald's innocence was established. Carruthers rose and paced, the wool of his trousers whispering softly on the polished floor. What about the servants? Miss Flint seemed frightened, and now Mary and Mrs. Fenwick have revealed more than they perhaps intended. Could one of them be involved? Whimsy rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Possibly. Fear can be a powerful motivator and a useful tool for manipulation, but servants rarely possess the detailed knowledge required to forge documents or manipulate the family narrative at this level. More likely, they are pawns or messengers. He turned abruptly, eyes sharp with renewed purpose. There is, however, one element we have not yet examined fully, the enigmatic Miss Flint herself. Diana's breath caught. You suspect she had a double life? Indeed. Such a volatile woman, mysterious in her origins and sudden in her demise, must surely have secrets that reach beyond the superficial. Whimsy took a step toward the writing desk, lifting one of Miss Flint's personal letters they had found earlier. The paper was brittle, but the handwriting clear, a series of cryptic allusions to uncovering truths and paying the price. Her words suggest she was close to a discovery that frightened more than just the servants, and the letter to you, Miss Blundell, hints at a conspiracy rooted not only in inheritance but in long-buried family sins. Diana swallowed, her hands trembling. What sins? That, Whimsy said quietly, is what we must uncover. He turned toward Carruthers. I want a thorough search of the village records, any mention of a missing Blundell child or unexplained adoptions. Simultaneously, we must verify Reginald's movements down to the precise minute during the past fortnight. Carruthers nodded. I will see to it immediately. Whimsy then addressed Diana directly. Miss Blundell, your cooperation is vital. I must ask you to grant me full access to the family correspondence, and if possible, to your late father's personal papers. Diana hesitated, but nodded. Of course. Anything to find the truth. As they prepared to leave the room, Whimsy's eyes lingered on the heavy curtains, the intricate weave catching the light in peculiar ways. Curious, he murmured. These curtains. The fabric pattern is one I've seen before, and they have been recently altered. Diana looked puzzled. Altered? How? Notice the seam here, Whimsy said, drawing back the curtain slightly. An addition, perhaps to obscure a window or to muffle sound. Carruthers frowned. Soundproofing? Exactly. And a soundproofed room would be the perfect place for secret conversations, conversations that must not be overheard. He turned back to the others with a wry smile. The house is whispering, and we have only just begun to listen properly. The day progressed with a feverish intensity. Carruthers departed to the village archives, while Whimsy and Diana moved to the study where the late Mr. Blundell had conducted much of his business. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper, an atmosphere that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the outside world's chaos. Whimsy settled into a leather armchair and began leafing through bundles of letters and diaries. One particular entry caught his attention, a passage describing a secret meeting in the village churchyard late at night between Mr. Blundell and an unknown correspondent. Diana leaned closer. Could this relate to the photograph and Miss Flint's warnings? Quite possibly, Whimsy said, marking the page carefully. Our late Miss Flint may have stumbled upon these old correspondences and recognized their significance. As the afternoon waned, a sudden knock at the study door startled them. It was Mrs. Fenwick, her face drawn but resolute. Lord Peter, there is someone here who wishes to speak with you, Miss Flint's cousin, Mr. Alistair Crane. Whimsy rose, his curiosity piqued. Show him in. The man who entered was tall and gaunt, his expression guarded but weary. His eyes darted nervously as he approached. Lord Peter Whimsy? He asked, voice low. That is I, Whimsy replied, inclining his head. I have come because I believe I know the truth behind Anne's death. And the photograph, Mr. Crane said. Whimsy gestured for him to sit. Do speak freely, Mr. Crane. For the first time that day, the atmosphere shifted palpably. A new player had entered the stage, and the game of shadows threatened to become dangerously close to the light. Anne was no stranger to secrets, Mr. Crane began, his voice barely above a whisper. She discovered things about our family that some wished would remain buried, things that could ruin reputations and lives. And the photograph? Whimsy prompted. Part of a larger scheme to claim what rightfully belongs to Anne's branch of the family, Crane said grimly. But someone powerful wants it suppressed. Whimsy nodded slowly. Powerful enough to kill? Mr. Crane's eyes darkened. I fear so. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Diana and Carruthers, both waiting silently for his next move. The investigation was no longer confined to the polite confines of Wotton Mere. It was about to plunge into the very heart of a family's darkest secrets and into the shadowed corridors where truth and deceit danced a deadly waltz. Mr. Alistair Crane's confession hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with unspoken threats and half-truths. Lord Peter Whimsy regarded him steadily, the faintest curl of a sardonic smile twitching at the corner of his mouth, as if already contemplating the deeper game beneath these overt revelations. You say Anne uncovered secrets. Pray, Mr. Crane, does your knowledge extend beyond mere hearsay, or are we navigating a minefield of conjecture? Whimsy's tone was light, but his eyes betrayed a sharpened edge. Crane shifted uneasily, hands clasped tightly in his lap. I was closer to Anne than most believed. We corresponded frequently, and she confided in me about her discoveries, about discrepancies in the family history, unexplained absences, and most significantly, about an illegitimate branch of the Blundell line that was systematically erased from public records. The photograph, it was proof, tangible proof, of that branch's existence. Proof that could unsettle the entire family tree, I presume, Diana ventured, her voice trembling slightly. Precisely, Crane said grimly. The photograph was not just an image, it was a symbol of a claim that threatened fortunes and titles. Anne intended to bring this to light, but someone intervened. Whimsy's gaze hardened. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question, who stood to gain from silencing Miss Flint? The room fell silent save for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. Then, with a resigned sigh, Crane began. You already know Reginald was an easy target. But the real threat was closer to the estate, a man whose public facade was impeccable, yet whose private ambitions were ruthless. Whimsy leaned forward, fingers steepled. Do you speak of a family member? Yes, Crane whispered, voice low. Edward Blundell, the current heir. He stood to lose everything if Anne's revelations came to light. Diana's breath hitched. Edward, but he has always been so proper, so reserved. Exactly, Crane said, which made his duplicity all the more dangerous. Whimsy paused thoughtfully. And what of this alleged intimidation in the telegram? Did Anne receive threats? More than threats, Crane confirmed. She was followed, her correspondence intercepted. On the night of her death, she was expecting a visitor, someone she trusted to help her, but no one came. The detective's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of shadow and light. And you say Anne's death was no accident? No, Crane replied. It was murder. At that moment, a knock at the door broke the tension. Carruthers entered, his expression grave but animated. Lord Peter, I have news from the village archives. There's a curious entry in the baptismal records from nearly 40 years ago, an unregistered child born to a Blundell servant. The child was adopted out quietly, but the timing matches the gap in the family tree. Whimsy's eyes glimmered. A missing heir, then. The plot thickens. He turned to Diana. Miss Blundell, have you ever heard of this before? Diana shook her head slowly. No, but it would explain so much. The family's secrecy, Anne's obsession with the past. Whimsy rose, pacing the room. We now have a clear motive and a likely suspect, yet the how remains elusive. How was Anne silenced, and who manipulated the timeline to frame Reginald? He stopped by the window, staring out at the bleak landscape beyond. The altered curtains, the tampered clock, these are not mere distractions. They are deliberate misdirections. Carruthers nodded. But Edward's whereabouts on the night of the murder are accounted for, aren't they? Whimsy's lips curled. On paper, yes. But as we've seen, paper can be doctored with as much care as photographs. He turned sharply, eyes alight with revelation. We must revisit the servants' testimonies, especially those who might have observed Edward's movements without realizing their significance. Diana frowned. Miss Flint mentioned a secret meeting in the churchyard. Could Edward have been there? Possible, Whimsy agreed. And if so, under what pretense? More importantly, who else was involved? The detective gestured toward the letters on the desk. I want a full examination of Anne's correspondence with her unknown contact. This visitor she expected the night she died. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Whimsy and Carruthers moved to the village churchyard, the scene of whispered meetings and hidden truths. The stone benches and ancient yews stood silent, but the air felt charged, as if history itself waited to reveal its secrets. Whimsy surveyed the surroundings with a keen eye. The perfect place for clandestine rendezvous, wouldn't you say? The ancient trees provide cover, and the grave markers offer convenient hiding spots. Carruthers nodded, sweeping the area with a flashlight despite the daylight. There's a faint trail of disturbed earth near that mausoleum. Fresh, curious, Whimsy murmured. Could it be a burial site? Or perhaps the hiding place of a document? As they bent to examine the soil, a sudden sharp cry shattered the stillness. Turning swiftly, Whimsy spotted Diana running toward them, clutching a folded piece of paper. Lord Peter, she gasped, I found this tucked behind a loose stone in the church wall. Whimsy took the paper and unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, hastily written, the ink smudged but legible. If you read this, beware those who smile with the kindness of saints, but hide the venom of vipers. The truth lies not in the light, but in shadows where the guilty tread. Trust no one but the dead. Carruthers whistled low. Cryptic, but chilling. Indeed, Whimsy said, and yet rather poetic for a dying warning. He pocketed the letter thoughtfully. We are dealing with a conspiracy deeper than mere forgery or inheritance squabbles. Returning to Wattenmere, Whimsy contemplated the growing complexity. Every clue pointed to a labyrinth of deceit, where loyalty was a mask and truth a ghost to be chased. That evening, seated by the fire with Diana and Carruthers, Whimsy outlined their next steps. "We must confront Edward Blundell directly," he said. "His public persona must now be tested against the facts we have gathered." Diana's eyes flickered with a mixture of hope and dread. "Do you think he will confess?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "I doubt it. The guilty seldom do. But a careful interrogation, combined with a reenactment of the night in question, may unmask the cracks in his story." He leaned back, cigar smoke curling languidly toward the ceiling. "And in the meantime, we must keep our ears open and our wits sharper. The shadows at Waddenmere are long, and some secrets cling stubbornly to the darkness." As the fire dwindled to embers, the detective's mind remained a relentless engine of logic and irony, prepared to uncover the uncomfortable truths that no amount of velvet curtains or ticking clocks could forever conceal. The next morning dawned with a pale, reluctant light filtering through the heavy curtains of Waddenmere's drawing-room, lending the chamber an air of subdued expectancy. Lord Peter Whimsy sat poised in an overstuffed armchair, a cigarette smouldering gently in an ashtray nearby, the very picture of genteel patience. Diana Blundell, pale but determined, arranged her notes on the low table before them, while Carruthers paced the room with the restlessness of a hound scenting the faintest trail. "It strikes me," Whimsy began, breaking the comfortable silence, "that we have thus far indulged in the luxury of shadows and conjecture when the time has come to illuminate our quarry with a direct beam." He looked up, eyes gleaming with that mixture of urbane amusement and icy precision. Edward Blundell must be confronted forthwith. Diana nodded, her fingers tightening around a sheet of paper. "It will be difficult. Father always said Edward had a manner so polished that he could convince a jury of his innocence without uttering a word." "Precisely the challenge," Whimsy replied, rising and lighting a fresh cigar with deliberate ceremony. "We shall see if that polish masks a flaw or two." The trio made their way to the stately library where Edward was already awaiting, impeccably dressed in the manner of a man accustomed to command, but with a subtle pallor betraying a restless conscience. His greeting was courteous but distant, a measured reserve that might have been either cool calculation or nervous formality. "Lord Peter, Miss Blundell, Inspector Carruthers," Edward said with a slight bow. "I understand you wish to discuss recent, unfortunate events." "Indeed," Whimsy said smoothly, taking a seat and gesturing for Edward to join him. "We have been reflecting upon Miss Flint's death and the curious photograph she left behind. A photograph that, by all accounts, should not exist." Edward's expression flickered ever so faintly. Miss Flint was an intrepid woman, no doubt, but she was also prone to flights of fancy. That photograph, if genuine, is an embarrassment to the family, but hardly grounds for murder, surely? "Embarrassment can be a powerful motive, Mr. Blundell," Whimsy observed, tapping ash thoughtfully. "You must understand, I'm not one for theatrical accusations without substance. We have before us a series of anomalies, timelines that do not cohere, testimonies that shift like shadows, and certain discrepancies in your whereabouts on the night in question." Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in his composed veneer. "I was attending to family matters at the estate, as all can confirm. My activities were accounted for by the servants." "Yet it appears the servants' testimonies vary," Whimsy replied gently. "Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper, recalls a man leaving the West Wing late in the evening, though she could not see his face clearly. Mr. Jenkins, the gardener, noted a figure near the stables. At a time you claim to have been in the library." Edward's jaw tightened. "The estate is vast. Shadows play tricks on the mind." "Quite so," Whimsy agreed. "But we are not relying on mere impressions. We have also discovered the clocks in the West Wing were deliberately set ahead by 10 minutes on that evening. A curious, detail, no?" Edward shifted in his chair, a faint sheen of perspiration betraying his calm facade. "I know nothing of that." "Perhaps not," Whimsy mused, "but it suggests a plan to confuse the timeline, And since the tampering would require access to the clock mechanisms, one wonders who would possess both the opportunity and motive. Edward's gaze darkened. You insinuate that I orchestrated this, that I conspired to murder my cousin. I do not insinuate, Mr. Blundell. I seek the truth. At that moment, Diana interjected softly. Edward, if you had something to hide, why not speak plainly? The longer the deception, the darker the suspicion. Edward rose abruptly, composure fraying. I have been nothing but loyal to the family and its legacy. Loyalty is a many-faceted gem, Whimsy replied, and sometimes it reflects light in surprising directions. The tension thickened, but before the conversation could deepen, a sudden knock interrupted them. Mrs. Hawthorne entered, her face flushed with urgency. Lord Peter, I thought you should know. There's been an incident in the servants' quarters. Mr. Jenkins has discovered something unusual. Whimsy stood instantly. Lead the way. They hurried through the labyrinthine corridors to the dim servants' wing, where the household staff usually kept their quarters. Mr. Jenkins, a burly man with dirt-streaked hands and eyes sharp as a hawk's, stood beside a narrow cupboard door ajar. Whimsy bent low to inspect. Inside lay a small, neatly folded bundle, papers, letters, and a photograph partially concealed beneath. He extracted the photograph carefully, holding it up to the light. It was an aged image, sepia-toned, showing a young woman bearing a striking resemblance to Anne Flint, standing beside a man with unfamiliar features, dark eyes, a hawkish nose. Who is this? Diana murmured. Ah, that is precisely the question, Whimsy said, scanning the letters hastily. One was addressed to Anne, written in a trembling hand, pleading for discretion. The letter mentioned a Jonathan, a name previously unheard in the investigation. Carruthers frowned. Jonathan. No one has spoken of him. Nor will they, if it's to protect the family's reputation, Whimsy replied grimly. This Jonathan is likely the missing link, the illegitimate heir Mr. Crane mentioned. Diana's eyes widened. But why hide him? And why would Anne seek him out now? Whimsy folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. Because the truth, once unearthed, threatens the foundation of everything the Blundells have built. Someone feared Anne's discovery so profoundly that they resorted to murder. He turned to Jenkins. How long has this been hidden here? Not more than a few days, my lord, Jenkins replied. I only stumbled on it while fetching cleaning supplies. Then someone planted these documents recently, perhaps to mislead or to reveal, Whimsy said thoughtfully. He cast a sharp glance toward Edward. Would you care to explain why these incriminating papers were concealed in the servants' quarters rather than the family archive? Edward paled. I had no knowledge of this. I swear it. Swear as you might, the evidence speaks louder, Whimsy said. I fear, Mr. Blundell, you're entangled deeper than you admit. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Inspector Carruthers, his face bearing news. Lord Peter, there's been a development. A witness came forward, Miss Evelyn Markham, the local school teacher. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. Miss Markham? How fortuitous. Carruthers nodded. She claims to have seen a man lurking near the churchyard the night Anne was killed. She is certain it was Edward. The room stilled. Edward's eyes darted nervously. I was nowhere near the churchyard that night. Yet your footprints tell a different tale, Whimsy said quietly. We shall soon know which story holds. The detective turned to Diana and Carruthers. Prepare to revisit the night's timeline with care. Every step, every shadow, every whispered secret will be scrutinized. The stage is set for the next act, and I intend to see the final curtain drawn. As Edward's protests echoed hollowly, Whimsy felt the inexorable tightening of the net around the killer. The photograph that should not exist had become a beacon in the gathering gloom, illuminating a path of betrayal, secrets, and a truth too perilous to tell. Until now. The afternoon shadows stretched long and languidly across the polished floorboards of Wotton Mere as Lord Peter Wimsey prepared for what he declared would be the most diverting entertainment yet, a private reenactment of the night in question. The very notion, delivered with his usual arch intonation, was met with a mixture of bewilderment and curiosity by Diana and Inspector Carruthers. Even Edward Blundell, now a markedly less assured figure, bore an expression that suggested he wondered if his comfortable illusions were about to be dismantled piece by piece. "It is elementary, yet theatrical," Wimsey explained, flicking the ash from his cigar into an ornate silver tray. "By recreating the movements and timing of all parties involved in the very rooms where shadows lie thickest, we might unearth the invisible threads that bind truth to fiction." The assembled company gathered in the drawing-room, a space whose wood-panelled walls and heavy drapes seemed to absorb the tense atmosphere. Servants hovered discreetly, well accustomed to the eccentricities of their lord's investigations, while Diana laid out the timeline as it stood, each minute accounted for with painstaking detail. "Mr. Jenkins," Wimsey began, addressing the gardener with a nod, "you mentioned seeing a figure near the stables around 10:30. Might you recreate the path you observed?" Jenkins obliged, walking the corridor with measured steps, his memory as precise as one might expect from a man so attuned to the rhythms of the estate. His account was corroborated carefully against the positions of doors, window locks, and the chiming of the hall clock, itself a focal point of the investigation. Meanwhile, Edward maintained a studied silence, his eyes flickering now and then toward the clock above the mantelpiece, a clock that, as Wimsey suspected, had been an instrument of deception on that fatal night. As the reenactment proceeded, Wimsey's keen gaze never faltered, noting subtle discrepancies with the detached amusement of a chess master watching his opponent's blunders. The servant's recollections, once confidently delivered, began to reveal small contradictions. A door supposedly locked was found ajar, a curtain drawn inconsistently, the soft creak of a floorboard at odds with the declared timing. The detective's moment of triumph came as he turned to Edward with a smile both benign and sharp. "You claim to have been in the library until nearly 11, did you not?" Edward nodded, lips pressed thin. Yet, according to Mrs. Hawthorne, the West Wing clock chimed 11 long before the hall clock. A curious anomaly, wouldn't you say? Edward faltered, the veneer cracking. I was unaware of any such discrepancy. Unaware, perhaps, but certainly not immune to its consequences. Wimsey's tone was mild but insistent. You see, the clocks were deliberately set ahead to manufacture an alibi, a temporal smoke screen. And since the mechanism is accessible only to those with the master key, we find our list of suspects narrowing. A low murmur rippled through the assembled. Diana's eyes were bright with a mixture of excitement and dread. "So, you believe Edward manipulated time itself to disguise his movements?" "It appears so," Wimsey agreed. "Or at least to create an illusion thereof." Then the detective moved toward the tall bookcase lining one wall, a monolith of oak and leather-bound volumes. He pressed a hidden catch, a feature not unfamiliar in country houses of a certain antiquity, and a section of the shelf swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. "This, dear friends, is the secret conduit that connects the West Wing to the servants' quarters," Wimsey said with a flourish. "A perfect escape route for a man wishing to traverse unseen." Edward's face paled, and for the first time a flicker of genuine fear shone through. I had no knowledge of this." "Oh, but your familiarity with the estate's less obvious features is something we have yet to fully ascertain," Wimsey countered. "Consider, too, the photograph concealed among the servants' belongings, its implications and timing." Carruthers stepped forward, producing a set of keys from his pocket. These were found on Edward's person when he was questioned earlier. One of them fits the secret passage. Lock! A stunned silence fell, broken only by the distant toll of the church bells, as if marking the passage of an unseen hour. Wimsey turned to Edward once more, voice calm but edged with finality. If you had the means to slip through the house unseen, the motive to silence your cousin's prying eyes, and the audacity to tamper with the very time itself, what remains but to admit your involvement? Edward's shoulders sagged, the proud posture of a scion reduced to a man cornered. Yet, in a last flicker of defiance, he shook his head. You have no proof, nothing concrete. Proof, Wimsey murmured, is often hidden in plain sight, obscured by the very desire to conceal it. He gestured to Diana. Miss Blundell, would you be so kind as to lay out the final sequence as it now appears? Diana complied, assembling the facts with care. Anne Flint's discovery of Jonathan's existence, Edward's growing desperation, the manipulation of clocks, the secret passageway, and the planted photograph, all converging into a timeline that left no room for doubt. Wimsey's eyes met Edward's, the quiet storm of intellect and authority contained within them brooking no contradiction. The murder was committed not in a frenzy of passion, but in cold calculation, a premeditated act to preserve a fragile facade. The room seemed to shrink around Edward, who finally broke, voice trembling. I did what was necessary. Anne's revelations would have destroyed everything. The estate, the family name, all for a shadowy bastard son. An abomination. Yet in trying to preserve a lie, you doomed yourself to a far darker truth, Wimsey said, his voice soft but unyielding. As Edward was taken away by Carruthers, his protestations fading into the somber quiet, Diana turned to Wimsey, a mixture of gratitude and awe in her gaze. My lord, she said quietly, you have uncovered not only a murderer, but the profound fragility of the masks we all wear. Wimsey smiled faintly, lighting a fresh cigar. Indeed, Miss Blundell, sometimes the most grotesque truths hide beneath the most civilized veneers. As the evening settled into the gentle hush of an English country house restored to uneasy peace, Lord Peter Wimsey allowed himself a moment of philosophical reflection. The photograph that should not exist, he mused, has done more than reveal a secret. It has illuminated the human heart's darkest chambers, and therein lies the true mystery. The night had settled with a heavy, almost oppressive silence over Waddenmere, the house itself seeming to hold its breath in the aftermath of Edward Blundell's arrest. Lord Peter Wimsey, however, was not one to allow the case to rest entirely upon the immediate confession or the neat closure of a single culprit. The gentleman detective, with his habitual blend of scholarly detachment and dry wit, knew well that the truth, particularly a truth so intricately woven as this, rarely surrendered its final secret without a lingering question or two left unanswered. As he paced the dimly lit library, the faint scent of cigar smoke curling around the mahogany shelves, Wimsey allowed his mind to turn once more over the events that had unfolded. Edward's motive had been clear, a desperate act to prevent scandal, an attempt to bury an inconvenient truth about Jonathan Flint, the son born in shadows. Yet beneath this surface explanation, something felt incomplete. The photograph, so carefully concealed and so explosively revealing, had been only one piece of a far larger puzzle, one that involved subtle manipulations and deft misdirections. Diana entered quietly, her expression reflecting a mixture of weariness and curiosity. My lord, I wonder if you will reveal the entire story tonight, or if there are further mysteries to be teased from the darkness. Wimsey gave a faint smile, one that suggested he rather enjoyed the role of enigma. Miss Blundell, the final flourish requires a stage, an audience, and above all, patience. But you are quite right. The photograph was merely the prologue. He gestured toward the window, where the moon's pale light spilled like a ghostly spotlight onto the garden paths. Consider, for a moment, the timing of Edward's movements and the curious irregularity of the clocks. We know he tampered with the mechanisms to forge an alibi. Yet the secret passage is a curious addition. Why would such an escape route exist here, in this rather staid country house? Diana pondered. It suggests planning, premeditation perhaps, beyond the murder itself. Someone who knew the estate intimately and anticipated the need for covert movement. Indeed, Whimsy agreed. And Edward, as the master of the house, certainly had the opportunity. But the question remains, was he the only one who understood the passage's utility? Their discussion was interrupted by the return of Inspector Carruthers, his brow furrowed beneath the weight of fresh news. "Lord Peter, we have discovered something of interest in the village records, an old diary belonging to the late Lord Whaddon, Edward's father." Whimsy's eyes lit with interest. "Ah, a whisper from the past to guide the present. Pray, what secrets does the diary conceal?" Carruthers laid the fragile book upon the table with reverence. "It contains notes on the construction of the house, including a detailed mention of the secret passage, but more importantly, it hints at family tensions long buried, rivalries and resentments concealed beneath a veneer of respectability." Whimsy flipped through the delicate pages, his fingers tracing the faded ink. "Here. See, Lord Whaddon speaks of his son's recklessness, and more intriguingly, of a woman named Eleanor, a governess dismissed under mysterious circumstances. She may well be the key to understanding the fractured family dynamics." Diana leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Could Eleanor have been Jonathan's mother?" "It is a possibility that demands exploration," Whimsy replied, a glint of anticipation in his eye. "And if so, her memory and influence would certainly threaten Edward's carefully maintained facade." The detective's thoughts returned to the photograph. That singular, damning image of Jonathan with his mother, a woman whose face had been cruelly obscured by time and circumstance, but whose significance was undeniable. "The picture does not merely expose a secret child," Whimsy mused aloud. "It evokes a legacy of concealed guilt and denial, the psychological undercurrents that shaped Edward's actions." Whimsy resolved that the next step must be a journey into the village archives to uncover more about Eleanor and the circumstances of her departure. The past, after all, was a dark corridor into which light must be shone if the present were to be fully understood. The following morning, accompanied by Diana and Carruthers, Whimsy made his way to the modest parish office. The room was lined with musty volumes, local registers, and fragile letters, a trove of forgotten lives waiting to be resurrected. As they sifted through the records, a portrait of Eleanor emerged, a woman of sharp intellect and gentle demeanor, whose dismissal had been sudden and unexplained. They discovered letters from Lord Whaddon to an anonymous correspondent, pleading for discretion and expressing deep regret. One letter, in particular, spoke of a storm soon to break and a truth better left buried. The puzzle deepened. If Eleanor had been dismissed to protect a secret, and if Jonathan was indeed her son, Edward's fear was more than personal scandal. It was the erosion of his inheritance, identity, and control. His crime was born of a psychological desperation, a desire to preserve not just a reputation, but the very foundations upon which his life was built. Whimsy's reflections were interrupted by Diana's discovery of a faded newspaper clipping, an announcement of a discreet adoption some years prior, a child taken into a nearby family's care under circumstances that suggested concealment rather than celebration. The pieces converged with chilling clarity. Jonathan had been hidden away, his existence erased from the family's public narrative. Edward's fury and fear stemmed from this erasure. The boy was not merely a secret, but a challenge to his legitimacy. Returning to Whaddon Mere, Whimsy felt the atmosphere of the house had shifted, as if the walls themselves now bore witness to the unraveling truth. He gathered the family and servants in the drawing-room once more, his voice calm but resolute. "Edward Blundell's guilt is established, but we must understand the full story, the why and the how. The photograph that should not exist was the catalyst, but the true murder lies in the destruction wrought by denial and fear. He recounted the diary's revelations, the letters, and the discovery of Jonathan's concealed existence, his tone weaving a narrative that laid bare the psychological torment behind Edward's actions. The secret passage, the manipulated clocks, the forged alibis, all were instruments of a man battling to preserve a fragile empire of lies. As the evening drew to a close, Wimsey addressed the silent room with a final, dry observation. In the end, the past is never truly buried. It only waits for the patient observer to uncover its dark corners, and it is there that the most profound mysteries and tragedies reside. Diana's eyes shone with gratitude and something deeper, an understanding of the complex human story beneath the crime. Wimsey, lighting a final cigar, allowed himself a moment's quiet satisfaction. The photograph had indeed existed where it should not, and in its existence it had shattered illusions, exposed fragile egos, and revealed the uncomfortable truth that even the most genteel of houses may conceal the darkest of secrets. As he prepared to depart, he glanced back at Whaddon Mere, the moonlight casting long shadows across its venerable facade. Justice, he mused, is a candle flickering in the gloom, fragile, yet indispensable. With that, Lord Peter Wimsey disappeared into the night, leaving behind a house forever changed by the photograph that should not have existed. The air in the drawing-room was thick with a mixture of anticipation and unease as Lord Peter Wimsey prepared to lay bare the final threads of this tangled mystery. The family and servants had gathered once again, their faces pale and drawn from the ordeal that had unfolded over the past days. Even Edward Blundell, now securely in custody, seemed to listen with a faint flicker of apprehension as Wimsey's calm, measured voice began to unravel the last layers of deception. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wimsey began, "we have traced this unfortunate sequence of events back to a secret, long buried, a secret that shaped not only the fate of Jonathan Flint, but the very lives of this household." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Edward's desperate act was born not merely from fear of exposure, but from a profound dread of losing control over his legacy. He walked slowly to the mantelpiece, where the infamous photograph lay beneath glass, its presence a silent testament to truths that refused to remain hidden. This photograph, so carefully concealed and yet so powerfully revealing, was the spark that ignited a fire of paranoia. But the fire was kindled long before by the hidden past of Eleanor, the governess whose dismissal was no accident, but a deliberate effort to suppress a scandal. Wimsey turned to face Edward directly. "Edward, you feared that Jonathan's existence would unravel your carefully constructed world. But your crime did not end the threat. It only exposed the fractures in your family's foundation." The detective then addressed the others, his eyes meeting each one with steady clarity. The secret passage, the manipulated clocks, the alibis, they were all part of a carefully orchestrated attempt to maintain the illusion. Yet it was the interplay of human frailty, fear, jealousy, denial, that ultimately brought tragedy. A hush fell over the room as Wimsey revealed the final piece. But there is more. Our investigation uncovered that Edward was not alone in his desperation. A letter from Lord Whaddon hinted at someone else, an accomplice hidden in plain sight. He produced a folded note found in the library, bearing a familiar handwriting. All eyes turned to Lady Florence Blundell, whose composure began to falter. Wimsey's tone softened slightly. "Lady Florence, your attempts to shield the family name extended beyond mere silence. You provided Edward with means and motive, driven by loyalty but blinded by fear. The shadows you cast were darker than anyone could have guessed." The room seemed to contract with shock, yet the truth shone through unrelenting. Lady Florence's tearful confession followed, explaining her complicity not as malice but as misguided protection. Whimsy concluded with a reflection on the nature of secrets and justice. The past may be shrouded in darkness, but justice, though sometimes slow, is inexorable. It is not merely the law we serve, but the truth, a truth that can set us free even from the heaviest chains. As the household began to absorb this final revelation, the weight of unspoken burdens lifted slightly. Jonathan, no longer a shadowed figure, was welcomed back with tentative hope. Whimsy gathered his coat, ready to depart. Before leaving, he offered Diana a brief nod. "Remember, Miss Blundell, the greatest mysteries are not always in the crimes themselves, but in the hearts of those involved." With that, the detective stepped into the night, leaving behind a house forever marked by its secrets, but now poised to heal in the honest light of day.